Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's topic of the week. My name is Alec, and we have here Joshua Cheatham. In this week's topic of the week, we're going to be discussing NATO's lack of inner unity. I want to be very careful on how I word that, because I don't want to say lack of unity on issues, because there are some issues that NATO is they all work together on, but what is fascinating is their inner unity amongst each other. And we found this when we were visiting NATO and we had discussions with three diplomats discussing about three different talks. So it
Yeah,
was just three different topics. So one on was in general about NATO, correct?
yeah, in
In
general,
general, and then the second one was on the Ukraine conflict, and the third one was the Middle Eastern North Africa region.
yeah.
When
We
we
didn't
were
really get to that
hearing,
one though.
huh?
We didn't really get to that. So it was just an open discussion.
It was an open discussion. It was like half, and then half was just
It was a good discussion
it
though.
was a good discussion.
Yeah.
But anyways, what we found fascinating was when we heard these three diplomats speak about NATO, all three of them had a different view of NATO.
It was
One
very
sees it,
fascinating.
the first diplomat saw it as, what did he see it as?
All right, I got this. He said, first speaker, he was like, we were discussing how there's a lack of, we asked the question, is there a lack of unity when it comes to the Ukraine? And he says, he's like, there's basically it's not like one big family. We're not a big family.
That's what it
Everyone
is.
acts in self-interest based on their sovereignty. So that's what the first speaker said. The second speaker, he was a public relations guy, to be clear. We're not going to name names for obvious reasons. Um, but he was a public relations guy for NATO, so obviously he's going to be treading a little bit of a line there. The second girl was a diplomat who was working on the policy between Ukraine and Russia, and she said that Russia was surprised by the West's resolve to come to the aid of Ukraine, implying, I'm going to say Western unity because it was NATO kind of makes up most of the West. And then the third speaker said the opposite, direct opposite of the first speaker, and it said NATO is like one big happy family, which is so crazy. And he is also a diplomat who has been, I think, 20 years as a diplomat, but not
I
in
think since
NATO.
'04.
Yeah, 20. It's a lot of time in
Yeah.
NATO. So
This
this
is,
fascinating.
yeah.
So
I,
cool.
I was particularly interested. At first, it didn't hit me until you were talking about it, and I was like, wait, whoa. Which is very interesting because right, in the beginning of the war, they were all unified. One resolved, one everything. I don't know what happened, but the national interest started to get into the way
Hmm.
of what NATO would do with Russia, Ukraine, because some of these countries were dependent on Russia anyways because of oil and natural gas.
Yeah.
So I understand what the first speaker meant by there is like no unity and it's all national interest. But we went from being united to national interest to now NATO being united again with all these programs, all these military programs that we're sending. But it's more of the United States and kind of Germany sending things like HIMARS, Leopard tanks,
Yeah.
and now we're working on F-16s. So it's interesting to see that the idea of NATO unity is always a shifting definition,
Yes.
which is very, very
And
interesting.
this is obviously this is a three speaker sample. So this might not be the same. It might be like, oh, NATO's more on the United side for these workers. But here's the thing. There's only what did they say? 800 employees for NATO, civil and
100,000,
military.
somewhere around
It
there.
was like no, it was like 800. It was like really small. Like not like the soldiers, like the
Just like,
like the
staff.
personnel. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not very big. And so and also the difference is their staff. They're supposed to act in the interest of NATO versus the countries are supposed to act in the interest of the country, but also of NATO. So that could be a different contrast as well. And why, the public relations guy could have just been seeing it because he has to work directly with those countries. He has to ask them, how do we do this? What are you going to talk about and discuss with this? And then he's going to hear those perspectives. But the other two, they work for NATO. And that's it. Like they work for NATO. NATO's goals are NATO's goals, not anything else.
I mean, they're still bound by the country.
They are, yeah.
and they still have to somewhat maintain interests, right, to
Hmm.
ensure that whatever they say is indeed pro NATO, but also pro their country. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of balancing when you're a NATO staff because you don't want to be just fully NATO and doing everything what NATO says because then now you're not abiding by what your national interests are into NATO. So, but again, even then, they're just well, they were policy analysts,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
even then, it's like they see
a little
NATO,
differently.
yeah, a little differently. Even as an analyst in NATO, which is in the integral part of NATO and providing information to member countries.
And so it's very fascinating because like the last two basically said that NATO is together, but from what I don't know what you've read, but from what I read is that like, NATO has lack of vision and strategy on certain issues. And so one of those being Russian sanctions, others being, in bringing in Sweden into NATO, and then also with strategy towards China and the Taiwan Strait and the Chinese Sea, South China Sea, all a little bit different. If you ask a different NATO country, like Hungary is going to say, what do I care about this? And the U.S. and the UK and France and Germany are going to be like, well, like this affects how much money we make, and if the war's going to start. And so that obviously the division is not togetherness in terms of what the Russian war did is kind of create togetherness, but it's kind of slipping backwards now again.
And I think you're correct, right? Because we're seeing this too. I mean, like I said before, it's been a lot of up and downs and not really exactly clear on what NATO's and member states' stance is, but the Biden administration says that they want and will prioritize efforts aimed to prevent member states from going astray and working with them to maintain robust support for Ukraine. So, the United States does believe in a united NATO and wants to keep NATO, they keep the image of NATO alive. They want to keep all the dialogue within NATO homogenous. So, yeah, I mean, it makes sense and it's important because what's NATO without everyone working together?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
for Ukraine to be sovereign, Ukraine is relying on us. And
Hmm.
if we can't work together within NATO, what's the point?
Yeah, and here's where like coming up with things in my head at the moment. Then when the war first started, the United States and a bunch of other countries basically said, we condemn Russia. Well, I don't really. I could be very wrong. I don't recall a NATO message, if you know what I mean, like that came from the NATO headquarters. Like this is a NATO thing, not a U.S. or UK
I
thing.
think you're correct, but I also remember something about Jens Stoltenberg?
Is
How do you
that he
say? The head of
the head of
NATO,
NATO? Okay, so
chief of
okay,
NATO. I
I don't
do
remember
remember
the message.
a message, well, of course, because he's the head of all participants, really. I think I do recall him saying something about from the beginning of war, like a strong stance of like NATO is opposed to this, or something along those lines.
Yeah, so that's I'm gonna consider that a NATO stance because he's the head of the
Yeah.
NATO army, um, or the NATO headquarters. So that's okay. But the next thing is that they got to come up with more policy things where they don't have not written policy, but what's the word for it? Like they're just saying they're saying direct. They're giving direction
Yeah.
to like a policy okay, here's or stance. They're giving a stance. That's the word. Oh my goodness, like a firm stance. Like we condemn China from blank. Not obviously not going to do that, but something that's firm. And they need to come out with more of those statements, which could be blanket statements that can go unity, which can deter a lot of people.
I feel like that was said by one of the speakers, where it's like, I don't know if it was the second or third speaker, but they said something along the lines of, we need more written stuff.
Mm.
Because in NATO is just a bunch of dialogue
Ooh,
amongst
I think
each
that was
other.
the third one. That guy.
Was it the third one? You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
And that is very important because you would think that in NATO they would have a lot of written statements, written
Mm,
policies, written reports. But really, it's just been a bunch of dialogue.
yeah,
And it's like, we want to do this, we want to do that. And the stuff that comes out is concrete, right?
yeah,
But most of the things that come out are not fully like, this were, for example, the big hesitant on whether or not Germany was going to send or allow the license of leopard tanks,
yeah. Leopard tanks.
um, to
First
release
episode.
that. Yeah. Yeah. The very first episode. Yeah. And it's like, it took a while for them to give the okay, but I don't remember being something written, right? Like
Yeah,
a
because
written
I guess it's up to.
address to NATO saying, Germany is allowing anyone that's carrying licenses for the Leopard tanks to now send them
And you
out.
know what can change how that direction is? It is like it'll look bad on Germany. I think what the problem with the Scholz is that he was like, oh, it's going to look on Germany like Germany is attacking Russia. But if he gives it a NATO call and says, okay, we're going to do this, and everyone in NATO can send tanks, then all of a sudden they can say, oh, okay, NATO is sending Leopard tanks to Ukraine, kind of uniting them in a sense. But then that's a
Yeah, that's exactly how I was trying to piece that in my mind.
yeah,
Yeah, I just didn't figure out how to piece it.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I like that, and I think another thing that NATO can do too is I think they need to get their partners more involved. So when we were reading, we got a little pamphlet from them, and it was like it had all their partners on it, on Japan, South Korea,
Don't,
no, a
don't
couple
worry,
other
this is
ones.
all unclassified.
Yeah, this is all
They
unclassified
they
stuff.
gave
Yeah,
us two things that were unclassified.
yeah, it says on the top,
Yeah.
of the papers they gave us. And so I think maybe getting them more involved and maybe like right. I don't know if is there written policy that they're partners or it's just like, hey,
With their partners?
you're a partner.
I know
I'm
on
not so
their
sure.
public diplomacy side, they're like, they are our partners and they work with us.
Okay.
But again, I understand for classified reasons and for secrecy, they don't really release a lot of like what written policy is.
Yeah.
But like going back to the Germany Leopard tanks example, it's like if Germany approved this, right? And they sent a written statement to NATO saying these are our policy guidelines.
Yeah.
We want you to share this with all of NATO members that may house Leopard tanks. Then
A blanket statement.
yeah,
That's all you need because it's policy at
yep.
that point. It's not airtight. Like it's very open, but it works. It
It's
shows
just
unity.
enough so it's not like where it's okay, we need Germany's acceptance. It's more like we need NATO's acceptance.
Yes. Yes.
Like we need NATO to talk. We need NATO staff to talk to Germany to release that. It's not NATO staff needing to talk to. Oh, how
Or
can
the
I?
West needs to talk to Germany into getting them to send tank
Right.
versus NATO is working with the Germans to send
Exactly.
tanks.
Exactly. And that's the stance. And that's kind of what their stance was, is that NATO is a treaty organization. So they need to kind of, how do I say this? Because they're a bunch of staff members, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Bunch
these
of stuff.
staff members are, do I want to use the word lobbying? I don't know if it's,
For lack of a better word, yeah,
yeah.
you can use it.
It's like they're lobbying for these members that are a part of NATO.
Yeah,
Because
that's
people
true.
see NATO as, okay, 31 states?
32.
32?
Mm-hmm.
32 states, military alliance. But it's more like these states are joining an organization type thing. That's how they, I think
It's got a
that's,
headquarters.
I think
It
that's
should be an organization. And that's what it says in
right.
the end, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but
That's
people
how
view it as an alliance.
the diplomats were saying it, right?
Yeah.
Is that these are member states signing onto the organization because people see NATO as a defense pact,
Yeah.
which they in their talk that was not the case in how they viewed it, which also shifted how I thought of NATO as well.
Yeah, because an organization is much different than a treaty. Like when you join a treaty, countries have to abide by that treaty, but there's like, there's no like headquarters, there's no annual meeting, like the G20.
Right,
That's
exactly.
a treaty. or not even that's even a dialogue. But if you look at NATO, it's an organization. They have a headquarters. We've been in it. Um, they have a leader, a director general, and then they have he's the director general of the civilian side, right? Or he's the director general of everything.
Of everything.
Yeah,
Staff,
and then they also have
fucking.
the NATO general. So if you have all that, the countries can't like look at it as a treaty. It's much different.
And you could, like, even for our viewers, right? You could see, like, the talk we're having is very difficult because there is no clear stance.
No, 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 no,
Like,
no.
we're trying to piece together right now as our goal is, like, what NATO really is and what it's defined as.
Yeah.
It's like, well, remember the map? It was like a little, not map, but it was like a little tree branch of, like, there's the staff side and there's the
Oh
military
yeah.
side. That's what I'm thinking of every time, right? And it's
Split.
like, there's the military side where military experts from these member states partake in,
Mm.
right? But then you also had your staff side, which is just a bunch of analysts and people who work at NATO but are not really a part of a member
So I
state.
just came up with an idea in my head. Do you remember how, I don't know which one it was, but one of them said that NATO doesn't have an army.
Right.
It's, the elites of their countries. What if that changed? And you send a certain amount. There's one NATO military base, just one, somewhere in Europe, and you send,
I
you
mean, we
know,
do have, there's NATO bases that exist. There's NATO air
well,
bases.
like a headquarters, like a
Right.
military headquarters, where they send in a certain amount of troops from each of them, and it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to exceed more than like 100 per, country. You probably wouldn't even exceed 100 per country, and you send them over, and they staff the base, and they work as an army for NATO.
So they would have a NATO patch, not a patch of the country.
Yes, and that
That
could change the
really
unity.
changes what NATO is
Yeah, it
then.
changes the unity side of it. And they don't have to be like, if the country goes, if NATO goes to war with somebody, they're not going to be the first responders, obviously. That shouldn't be the case. But the fact is, if you send military soldiers to a headquarters to work with other militaries on policy, you create a more sense of unity in that case, especially on the armed front.
That is pretty good hot take.
Yes.
Because I'm trying to think of it, right? You have a NATO, right? A NATO soldier with a NATO patch on it. They go to war.
Just like with the UN.
That's what
Like,
I'm trying to think of
yeah.
as the peacekeepers, right?
Oh, yeah, that could be their job.
That's what I'm thinking, right?
Peacekeeper.
But it's like, why do we need UN peacekeepers anyways?
Well, obviously, NATO peacekeepers would be able to do
They
much
would
more,
be able to do
much,
much
much
more
more.
than UN peacekeepers would, and UN peacekeepers would be more globalized, right? For more global
Yeah.
responses versus NATO, which is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And they
Mhm.
said what they did agree on, unity wise, is that NATO does not look to expand to other countries
That are outside of North
outside
Atlantic.
of the North Atlantic area,
Yeah.
which is United States and Europe. So I'm thinking that these NATO soldiers, right, would essentially be the peacekeepers of Europe.
So let's hypothetically look at this. You're in North Africa. Egypt in civil war. This is a threat towards NATO. They're right there. NATO sends in, let's say the headquarters has 20,000 troops sent from all 32 places. NATO sends in 5,000 troops, probably less, so it doesn't look like it's a war. Sends in 2,000 troops and says, like armor and everything. And then NATO diplomats on the civilian side, and they stop the fighting when they come down and start negotiations. The difference is that they can actively work with this whichever side they think is starting the problem. Let's say there's a civil war and one side is trying to throw a coup.
Right.
And we want that Egyptian government to be in power. We send our soldiers, trying to do diplomatic stuff, but we can use our forces to stop the coup.
Right.
A little different
I
from the
mean,
UN.
much more different
Much
from
different,
what
yeah.
the peacekeepers can do.
because they're peacekeepers, but they also use offense to create peace. I
Yeah,
guess in a sense.
very rarely.
Very rarely, but and I wouldn't go like more than using like special forces, to
Yeah,
cut heads off snakes and whatever. So it's
again,
interesting.
big hot take, but
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah,
It'd be hard because then you'd have to convince them that they're like you'd have to have many different people, many different backgrounds willing to cooperate. And what a lot of people view the U.S. as like, oh, they're the guys with the big guns and the big balls, and they're gonna be the guys that are on base causing crazy havoc and yada yada yada. Okay, which is a little true, but besides the point. You would have, a little bit of a hierarchy. United States stands top, UK, or sorry, Germany, UK, France, Canada, on the
right.
list. But I mean, it can create a sense of unity on the base.
Yeah,
I think it's cool. I think it could work not
it
in the near
could
future, but in the future. And it could
to
give them,
solve that unity problem at least,
it
but
can give them, like, cause look, we're in North Africa as NATO missions, but not NATO soldiers. What if NATO soldiers went to North Africa?
Mhm.
That changes the direction. This isn't just a US UK thing. This is a NATO thing.
But then it's like, who's the sponsoring country? Who is
That doesn't have to be
what
just NATO.
entity is? Then NATO becomes what entity then? If they have a military, what? It's just
They're still an organization.
I'm just trying to think, right? Let's say you have country A, B, and C, right? This is gonna go into Article 5 question.
Oh, okay.
So it's like country A, B, and C, they send their troops, right? You have a country A troop, country B troop, country C troop.
Hmm.
They go into this organization. Now they become NATO force.
Soldiers. Yeah.
And it's like, okay, these troops go to war with country D, and D retaliates. Who is D attacking? A, B,
NATO.
and C?
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. So yes, in essence, but at the same time,
Not really, because it's like,
not really. But here's the thing: if we have a NATO force to respond to an issue, you know, if we're actively sending troops into a war zone, which we actively send troops into North Africa. But if those troops kill U.S. soldiers, it's not a war on NATO.
I see.
Now you send NATO troops down there.
Hmm.
NATO is essentially you're attacking NATO, but they're just NATO already decided to go in, so now they're troops. They're NATO troops. It's not like if they kill those people, they're going to come attack people in NATO. But here's the other thing: you shouldn't be obliged. You don't have to be obliged to send those troops.
Hmm.
It be up to you. But just creating the headquarters is like this is a dialogue where all soldiers from all NATO countries can come and send their troops at any amount they want, exceeding not exceeding
You know what
200.
it's like? It's like PMCs. That's
Kind
what
of,
is essentially what it comes down to,
yeah.
sort of. But instead of private military contractors, your PMCs are technically
They're NATO.
people. Yeah, it's like you're not attacking country, you're attacking that.
NATO.
Yeah. Okay.
So
You're attacking the technically the PMCs or like the
so the difference is like if you kill a NATO troop, it's not a war on NATO. But if you invade a NATO country, that's a war on NATO.
yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we're sending in troops to the place versus them sending troops into our place. If Russia invades NATO, that's a war.
Right.
Now, okay, here's the other thing. If we sent NATO troops into Russia and they killed a NATO troop, that's a war on NATO. That's a different thing. That's a little different because first off, we'd be very stupid to send troops in, and the second off, Russia would declare war anyway,
Yeah.
even if we didn't kill them.
Yep.
But like in the current in Ethiopia, for example, there's a NATO missions in Ethiopia. If we send the troops in, they're NATO troops, and a NATO troop dies, it's not a war on NATO. We sent the troops in.
Yep.
But if by the far chance that Ethiopia decided to, wage war on Italy, then
It'd be
then that's an act of war against NATO.
right.
But it's a little
So
different.
it's almost like having the EU militarily organized. Is what it essentially boils down to. Kind of.
Hmm.
That's what the entire concept
Just
is.
with Canada and the United States involved in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it could really kind of give it a sense of direction, and it also doesn't. It also gives the ability to keep the country's, so not sovereign hand. It gives them the ability to make decisions. They don't have to send the troops to those headquarters,
Right.
but they can, and they can create like a partnership. In terms of it already is, but they can create a better one, a relationship.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it all comes down to addressing the unity within NATO. That's
Yeah,
all it is.
it is.
That's
Yeah,
all it is.
and that's one way to do it. Definitely a difficult one. Now that
It
I'm
is
thinking about it,
very, very difficult.
but it could work. But the other thing, the easy one is the blanket statement. NATO says this, NATO says that, yada 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 yada. And I'm sure they do that, but I'm sorry, a tweet or an Instagram post
It's not enough.
is not a message. It just isn't. I'm sorry. Like if I saw Putin put a tweet, "I'm invading Ukraine," I'm just gonna sit there and be like, "Ha ha." Like, you're stupid. But if he comes on air and he does it on the news web and when he said they were invading Ukraine, that's when I take it seriously. I don't take that kind of tweets or quotes seriously. That's not a NATO stance. NATO stance is when someone who represents NATO gets in front of the news sources and says something in the name of NATO. So that's what I think. You finding their Instagram?
No, I'm just like I'm on NATO's website right now,
Yeah,
just trying to figure out like what I'm trying to look for is like you know how you go onto the UN website, you go to the digital library, and you just see like
everything.
working group resolution, draft
Yeah,
resolutions, um, and like they're actual like clear.
your policies and
It's
everything.
policy, yeah,
Yeah,
and it's like it's on the NATO website, and it's just like you go to the newsroom section, and it's just news, media advisories, press office contacts, media accreditation, speeches and transcripts. Nothing like
nothing. Yeah.
just like resolution 1-27. I don't know,
Whatever it is.
right? It's not either I'm missing something or that's just what NATO just really needs. It just needs like they do what they do. They just need to make it like it's the same thing with
Concrete
it's the same thing with the United Nations, right? You have self-interests that still affect global policy, but at the end of the day, there's still a United
nation.
Nations statement,
Yeah,
solution, resolution that all countries still have to
yeah.
abide by.
Like when you get when something comes out, this is a resolution made by the parties to the treaty, made by the parties of UNESCO under the United Nations.
Correct.
That is unity. Whether or not anything got done
It's
is
still
different. It's
unity.
still a United Nations message.
Right.
That changes it versus like, US, a party of NATO says blank. That's not the same as NATO
Says
says this.
this.
Yeah.
Leave it up to a vote. At the end of the day, whether you agree or not, like look at the SDGs, right?
Yeah.
SDG
Hmm.
2030s. Some countries may not have agreed with it, abstained, accepted. At the end of the day, global policy says all countries need to adopt or get
These are
close
the
to.
guidelines of the UN.
Yep. These are the SDG guidelines.
Yeah.
Work towards them.
With the UN stamp right on the page.
Exactly.
That's important, because like it could say SDG, but without that UN stamp, it's just like whatever, who cares? But when you put the UN stamp on it, no matter what you think of the UN, it holds weight. Because if the US is abiding by it, if the Russians are abiding by it, if the Chinese are abiding by it, somebody's going to abide by it. And then at the end of the day.
Like,
So
hold on. Like, for example, they have a thing called in NATO. There's this thing called the Parliamentary Assembly Science and Technology Committee,
yeah,
right? And I just picked one random one from 2018. It says resolution on safeguarding elections in within the alliance, and it's the same thing. Like it looks like just like a UN resolution, right? But it's like I don't know. It just doesn't look the same or feel the same as a UN resolution.
And they have committees. I mean, we all know that. They're an
Yeah.
organization. They have to have committees. But like at the end of the day, what came out with that policy? Like when that started, did NATO post something somewhere that said NATO under this committee made a resolution that was abided by, this many parties, abstained by this, this and that. NATO, okay, that's a good here's a different situation. Maybe NATO just doesn't have a good, and hopefully the speaker doesn't hear this, public relations department and a press department that we do see this image. And so we get the wrong image of NATO. Because yes, they have committees and they come up with resolutions. That's obvious. But we don't see it often,
I mean, even at the
with the
end of the
NATO
day, right?
stance.
Two things, right? I think the public relations department are just very careful
Hmm.
on what they say about NATO because they don't want people to have the wrong image of NATO. And secondly, these NATO resolutions that come out, you still question whether
It's abided by everyone.
yeah, exactly. They can have a resolution, but is it like the UN where it's like resolution 478 says this, and this, and you cannot do it because it's international law,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Now, I'm not saying NATO
It's international law, but
creates international law, but the laws that govern what NATO countries do,
yeah.
if that makes sense. Like,
Hmm.
let's say, like, look, I'm looking at a random resolution that came from a NATO parliamentary thing,
Yeah.
and it says like, what is this? Security and cooperations in the High North. Alarmed by the speed of climate change in the Arctic regions, mindful of growing geostrategic importance of the Arctic, and it's 2 pages, right?
Hmm.
One is just like what they're calling out, and the second page is things like to bolster NATO's enhanced situational awareness to greater expertise in Arctic region. It's like, are member states the ones responsible are they nationally, right?
Hmm.
Have to be responsible for abiding by these? Is this a NATO thing where it's like, okay, NATO as a whole has to abide by? You get what I'm
You're
trying to say?
confused, yeah.
You're just confused because again, it goes back to the unity thing. You don't know what NATO is doing generally. You know what I'm?
Yeah,
Because with the UN, it's clear.
it's
You're
a
like,
UN goal.
this is a United Nations goal. Is there a NATO goal? Is what I'm trying to like
Yeah, I agree.
conclude this
I
off
don't,
with.
I don't think there is a NATO goal or a NATO direction really. And if there is, it's not. We don't know. We can't find it.
I mean, technically, our NATO goal is to support Ukraine, but with
But like, do all NATO countries send things into Ukraine? And you don't.
because you would think everyone that's in NATO would agree on all of the same things.
Yeah,
Like in the UN, not everyone agrees with what goes on with Resolution A,
but if it gets passed,
but if it gets passed, it's still the United Nations, all of the world
yeah.
is saying that yes, there's agreements and disagreements, but we believe that the majority says this, and
And most everyone will follow that policy because of the weight it holds. But if you don't have that weight, you can write a policy out, but if
because they just
yeah,
brush it off. They're like, oh well, if we don't agree with it, right? Oh well.
yeah, I
Because
mean,
that's what really that's technically what happens in NATO. I mean, let's look at the Turkey example, right, where they try to block Finland and Sweden's entrance into
yeah,
NATO, right? It's the same thing where it's like if one disagree, like all of NATO wanted Sweden and Finland to come in, but all it took was one Turkey to not let them in.
hmm,
Versus if we were to do this United Nations wise, one member state would not be enough to
I'm not sure the Security Council.
unless you're in the Security Council. But let's say it was up to a General Assembly resolution.
Yeah,
If all member states in a General Assembly resolution, except for one or two, say no, the entire world, the majority of the world says accept Sweden and Finland.
yeah,
But with one Turkey is enough to say that NATO does not want Sweden and Finland. Because that's what the image is at the end of the day. If Sweden and Finland do not enter NATO, that's saying that something, somewhere, someone on the inside is saying no.
yeah.
But even though NATO's image and NATO's statement was we want Sweden and Finland. Do you get what I'm
Oh,
saying?
mhm, yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, the image is different, but if one says no,
Yeah.
yeah, So yeah,
That's what I'm trying to conclude off here.
yeah,
And that's what I'm trying to get out.
I agree with that. That was, this is a roller coaster of one, but you're right. I mean, there's a lack of a clear vision, a clear goal, and a clear understanding of what NATO really does and what it is. And so, we know what their goal is to security alliance to protect the North Atlantic, which originally was made to, go against the Warsaw Pact. And so this military alliance is now basically to contain Russia, but that's it. I mean, they're working on things like climate policy. They're working on things like cyber policy. But why isn't that clear what NATO goals are in those regards? Like someone says one thing, but then like Turkey will be like, oh, whatever. Or like the UK will be like, no, that's not
And
what we
that
believe.
ruins the image of NATO, even though the majority of NATO is saying,
Yeah.
we want this, but all it takes is one vote, and it's like NATO does not want
Because
this.
technically, like, it's not like, yes, it's democratic, but it's not democratic, if you know what I mean. Because, like, in the
Right.
UN, when they create a resolution, if 13 people don't agree with it, it doesn't matter. That is a UN resolution. But if one person doesn't agree with it in NATO, the resolution's done.
That's exactly
Gone.
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yep. And
It's
I was like,
gone.
how is there unity if
One.
there's that power?
Yes, yes, yes. And that's a Security Council problem, which we will do an episode on that in the future. Um, yeah, yeah, that's all I got to say.
That was
Roller coaster.
wild.
Yeah.
I've never thought of something so in depth. It's just like three different speakers and all three different views. And it's
hmm
like, whoa, hold on.
Yeah,
You're telling me that even within NATO, you have a direction, but there's no unity? Like, come on.
'cause it's funny. It's like one person you can say, "Oh, this is how it is," and then the second person comes in and it's like, "Oh, okay, yes, they have contrasting views," but you know, it could just be like a slip of it could just be a very small thing. But then a third person says something different, and you go, "Okay, this is a pattern now." There's a difference.
Right.
Once you get to three people, you get three different perspectives. I think that's a pattern, in my opinion.
Yep.
So, anyways,
Need a breather after that one.
yeah, right. Um, Thank you guys for listening to this episode. We're so excited to get season 2 started off, and please keep listening to our episodes. Keep following us. The website's going to be up very shortly, hopefully,
Hopefully
and then
so.
we're going to utilize our social medias to the umpth degree so that you guys can really see what we're trying to do here and really get it.
And also connect with us too.
Yeah, please. Yeah, because we want to really give you guys every unbiased news that you can get, so that you can understand the world better.
Yep. So thank you for listening to this week's topic of the week, and we will see you in the next episode.